The marble atrium of the Davos Global Forum gleamed like a cathedral to wealth. Glass walls looked out on white mountains. Inside, the air smelled of espresso and ambition. Cameras panned past a river of navy suits until they found the small stage where two names had filled the room beyond capacity: Scott Bessent, hedge fund legend, market whisperer, the man who'd shorted empires and bought nations on the brink, and Ibrahim Traoré, the young president whose speeches were turning into rallying cries far beyond Africa. Bessent spoke first, voice even, vowels honed on trading floors and boardrooms. "Markets," he said, "are merciless teachers. Countries that reject disciplined capital don't just fall behind, they collapse." He let the last word settle, then added, almost casually, "Without partners like us, your projects stall, your currency buckles, your talent flees. That's not ideology. That's math." A murmur rippled. Some nodded. Others stiffened. The moderator turned to Traoré, whose posture hadn't shifted once Bessent began. "No entourage. No stack of papers. Just a simple charcoal suit with a thread of Sahel green at the lapel and the unhurried calm of a man who did not confuse money with mandate." Traoré leaned toward the mic. "Math," he said softly, "is honest. But the equations you prefer always start with someone else owning the variables." A few journalists glanced up. He continued, "You warned, without us, you'll collapse." He let it hang, then watch us stand taller. The room changed temperature. Phones lifted, red tally lights blinked on. Somewhere in the second row, a banker clicked his pen twice and stopped clicking. Bessent didn't flinch. He folded one leg over the other, the picture of patience. "Standing taller requires scaffolding," he said. "Supply chains, credit lines, market makers. Those don't appear by will." Traoré's eyes didn't leave him. "Nor do they disappear because we refuse to lease our future." He sat back, voice still level. "We're not against partners. We're against custodians." In the front row, a West African minister hid a smile behind his hand. On the aisle, a think tank fellow typed "Custodians is not equal to partners" and underlined it twice. The moderator glanced nervously at his cards. The script was already ash. Above the stage, the screens showed a split shot: Bessent's practiced poise, Traoré's unbothered certainty. Two doctrines. One floor. Outside, snow kept falling in quiet sheets. Inside, something heavier began to fall away, the assumption that capital's blessing was the last word on sovereignty. The moderator tried to steer the conversation back to the pre-approved talking points: emerging markets, sustainable growth, public-private synergy. But the tension between Bessent and Traoré refused to dissolve. Every exchange was a silent duel, the kind where no one raised their voice, yet each sentence landed like a blade. Bessent leaned forward, fingers interlaced, a faint smile playing on his lips. "President Traoré," he began, "sovereignty is admirable. But tell me, how will Burkina Faso finance its roads, its ports, its tech infrastructure without global capital flows? You can't fund ambition with slogans." The last word was coated in polite disdain, enough for the audience to catch the condescension without him saying it outright. Traoré didn't rush his answer. He let Bessent's question linger in the air, as if giving the man time to hear the echo of his own certainty. "We finance it," he said, "the way every truly independent nation has, by building capacity before building debt. By teaching our children to grow not just crops, but industries. By keeping profits in our soil instead of exporting them through your channels." A ripple of applause broke out from one side of the room, delegates from Mali, Niger, and Ghana, quickly muffled by the moderator's nervous cough. Cameras zoomed in on Traoré's calm expression. The green thread on his lapel caught the light like a small flag. Bessent chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Idealism has its place, but markets punish delay. The world moves faster than self-reliance can." Traoré's gaze sharpened, but his tone stayed measured. The world also moves faster than trust can be repaired. That's why we refuse to mortgage tomorrow for loans that arrive with invisible chains. The air thickened. A few CEOs shifted uncomfortably. The truth in his words was harder to dismiss than any spreadsheet. The moderator glanced again at the clock, clearly aware that this was no longer just a panel, it was a reckoning, streamed live to millions. Traoré leaned back, eyes still locked on Bessent. You think we fear collapse. But what we fear more is standing tall on legs we don't own. The moderator, sensing the weight of Traoré's last sentence, tried to redirect. Perhaps we can focus on collaboration models between private capital and sovereign states. But Bessent wasn't ready to yield. He straightened in his chair, his voice taking on the sharpness of someone used to having the final word in boardrooms. Mr. President, he said, you talk about ownership as if the global economy were optional. Without participation, without the liquidity and security that institutions like mine provide, you'll not only fall behind, you'll vanish from relevance. Gasps from the audience broke the otherwise hushed room. The statement wasn't just provocative, it was a public dare. The cameras caught the flicker in Traoré's eyes, a glint of something between controlled fury and unshakable confidence. He leaned forward just enough for the microphone to catch every syllable. Relevance, he replied, is not measured by how often we appear in your reports, Mr. Bessent. It's measured by how firmly we can stand when your markets tremble. And they do tremble, often. A ripple of murmurs spread through the audience. Bessent's lips tightened. He gestured toward the other panelists, as if appealing to reason. This isn't about dominance. It's about mutual benefit. You need scale, we need stability. Traoré's response came like a well-placed strike. Mutual benefit ends when one side writes the contract and the other signs away its future. The moderator's eyes darted nervously toward the press section. Headlines were practically being written in real time. Some reporters were already whispering phrases like, clash of economies, and, sovereignty versus capital, into their recorders. Bessent tried one last jab, his tone sugar-coated but heavy with warning. Be careful, President Traoré. Independence without resources is just a romantic story. Traoré didn't flinch. Then watch, he said simply, as we make it real. The words hung in the air like a challenge that no one dared to interrupt. Even the translators in their booths paused for half a beat, as if savoring the moment before relaying it in half a dozen languages. Bessent leaned back in his chair, his polished shoes crossed neatly, the picture of corporate composure. But his eyes betrayed a flicker of irritation. He was used to leaders playing defense in these exchanges, hedging their answers, softening their positions. Traoré, however, wasn't hedging anything. He was doubling down in front of an audience filled with investors who could shift billions with a phone call. You think the world will applaud this? Bessent asked, lowering his voice as though speaking to Traoré alone, even though the microphones caught every word. Investors don't back stubbornness. They back results. Traoré gave a small, knowing smile. And yet, here you are, listening to me. The audience chuckled softly, tension momentarily breaking. But Traoré didn't let it drift into humor for long. His tone grew firm again. We're not here to impress markets. We're here to build foundations strong enough to withstand them. If that's stubbornness, then stubbornness is a virtue. Across the room, a few African delegates exchanged proud glances. Others from Latin America and Asia leaned in, intrigued by the bluntness. Bessent, sensing he was losing control of the narrative, tried to shift the focus. Tell me then, Mr. President, he said, when your agricultural exports dip, when your reserves tighten, when the next drought comes, what will you do without the safety net we provide? Traoré's reply was calm, almost gentle. We'll do what our ancestors did, adapt, survive, and rebuild. But this time, we'll do it without asking permission. That line hit like a drumbeat. It was more than policy, it was defiance wrapped in history. And for the first time, Bessent didn't have a ready answer. The silence following Traoré's last words wasn't empty, it was charged. You could almost hear the mental gears turning across the hall. Reporters scribbled furiously, knowing they just witnessed a quote that would lead the evening's news. Bessent adjusted his cufflinks, a subtle stall for time. He glanced toward the panel moderator, perhaps hoping for a rescue, but none came. The spotlight had locked both men in place. "Mr. President," Bessent began again, this time with a tone meant to sound reasonable, "no nation can operate in a vacuum. The interconnected nature of our world means your economy's survival is tied to ours. We've built the structures, the logistics, the global rules that keep trade flowing. Without those, your vision collapses." Traoré leaned back, folding his hands in front of him. "You speak as if you invented the sun and the rain, Mr. Bessent. Trade existed before your rules, and it will exist after them. The only thing you've built is a habit, one where my people grow the resources and you decide their price." That drew a murmur from the crowd, half admiration, half shock. Bessent tried to counter. "And what happens when those prices crash? When the markets turn against you?" Traoré didn't hesitate. "Then we eat what we grow, and we stand on what we own. That's the difference. You fear collapse because you've built towers in the clouds. We build on the ground." The metaphor landed hard. Several African leaders at the table nodded in silent approval. One Latin American delegate even clapped softly before stopping himself. Bessent's jaw tightened, but Traoré had already shifted his gaze back to the moderator, signaling he'd said enough. It wasn't retreat, it was control. He had delivered his message, and nothing more needed to be added. The moderator, sensing the tension but unwilling to cut the moment short, leaned forward. "President Traoré, Mr. Bessent, what we're hearing is not just an economic debate, but a philosophical one. Is this about markets, or is it about sovereignty?" Traoré's eyes shifted from the moderator back to Bessent. "It's always been about sovereignty. Markets are tools. Tools can be shared, traded, or rebuilt. But sovereignty, once you give that away, you don't get it back." Bessent, keeping his voice even, countered, "Sovereignty without stability is chaos. Investors don't place bets on uncertainty." "Then don't," Traoré replied simply, his tone sharp enough to cut through the polite air of diplomacy. "We're not asking for your bets. We're planting our own seeds, building our own roads, training our own engineers. If you think that's uncertainty, it's only because you're not the one holding the blueprints." The audience murmured again. A camera zoomed in on Bessent's expression, a fleeting mix of frustration and disbelief. This wasn't the script he'd expected. Leaders often came to these forums to court investment. Traoré had come to declare independence. Bessent tried a different tactic, leaning into the microphone. "And when the cost of self-reliance becomes greater than the benefits? Will you still hold that line?" Traoré's answer was instant. "Freedom is always more expensive than dependence. But it's worth every cost. Because when you own your tomorrow, no one can threaten to take it away." That line landed like a stone in water, sending ripples through the entire room. Even those who disagreed with Traoré couldn't deny the conviction in his voice. The moderator cleared his throat, glancing at the clock, but the energy in the room made it clear, this exchange was far from over. Bessent sat back in his chair, the polished mask of composure starting to slip. "Mr. President," he said, his voice tightening, "ideals sound noble on stage, but reality is less forgiving. Global markets don't care about pride. They reward compliance and punish defiance." Traoré tilted his head, almost as if amused. "And yet, here I am, defiant, and still standing." The crowd reacted instantly, some with quiet laughter, others with an appreciative clap. The tension had shifted. What began as Bessent's confident critique was now feeling like a slow unraveling. "You mistake endurance for success," Bessent shot back, leaning forward. Your country's GDP is a fraction of ours. Without external credit, your growth will hit a wall. And without your permission, Traoré replied smoothly, we'll climb over it. That line drew the loudest reaction yet. Delegates from smaller nations, those long accustomed to being dictated to, were leaning in, their eyes bright. This wasn't just Burkina Faso's fight anymore. Traoré was giving voice to something they all felt. Bessent tried to reframe. The systems we've built, financial networks, trade corridors, they exist to keep order. Tear them down, and chaos follows. Traoré met his gaze directly. You confuse your order with the world's order. The world existed long before your systems, and it will exist long after. Silence followed. Even the translators in their booths paused briefly before relaying his words. Bessent tapped his pen against the table, a small but telling sign of irritation. For all his warnings, Traoré hadn't budged. And the more he pressed, the more the room seemed to shift toward the young leader's side. The moderator, sensing history in the making, let the moment hang. Cameras flashed. Somewhere in the audience, a whisper could be heard, he's not just talking to Bessent, he's talking to all of them. Bessent adjusted his cufflinks, a subtle attempt to regain control. You speak as though isolation is strength, he said, lowering his tone to something more deliberate. But without integration, you risk being left behind, cut off from innovation, from resources, from opportunity. Traoré didn't hesitate. We are not isolating. We are choosing our partnerships, not inheriting them. There's a difference. Bessent raised a brow. And what happens when your chosen partners fail you? When their economies crumble, or when they turn their backs? Traoré leaned slightly forward, his voice low but clear. Then we rebuild again. That's the beauty of owning your foundation, you don't need permission to start over. The room seemed to still, as if those present were holding their breath. A few diplomats from smaller nations exchanged knowing glances, these were words they had never dared to say aloud in such a forum. Bessent wasn't ready to yield. But rebuilding takes time, time your people might not have. Every setback costs lives, costs livelihoods. Are you ready to bear that responsibility? Traoré's reply came without a flicker of doubt. I already bear it. Every leader does. The question is whether I carry it for my people, or for yours. I choose mine. The crowd erupted in applause, short, sharp, and unrestrained. Bessent's jaw tightened. He had come to warn Traoré, to pull him back into the fold, but instead, the young president was turning the encounter into a rallying cry. Even the moderator, usually bound to neutrality, allowed the corner of his mouth to twitch into the faintest smile. Gentlemen, he said, I think the world just saw where you both stand. The camera zoomed in, capturing the stark contrast, Bessent's controlled frustration and Traoré's steady confidence. It was clear, one was trying to hold on to an old order, the other was already building the new. Bessent straightened in his chair, taking a long breath before speaking again. You talk about building a new order, he said slowly, but revolutions often eat their own. History is littered with leaders who thought they could rewrite the rules, only to be buried by them. Traoré didn't flinch. History is also filled with those who obeyed the old rules and vanished without ever trying to change them. A murmur ran through the audience. It wasn't just a debate anymore, it was a clash of philosophies, each statement like a chess move played in front of the entire world. Bessent pressed on. You think your defiance inspires unity, but it breeds instability. Investors will flee, alliances will fracture. And when they do, you'll find yourself standing alone. Standing alone, Traoré said, is better than kneeling together. The phrase landed like a strike. The delegates from nations long considered small sat taller, their eyes fixed on him. Some smiled faintly, as if hearing their own thoughts spoken aloud. Bessent shifted his focus, trying to appeal to reason. There's a cost to this path you're on, a cost paid not by you, but by farmers, by merchants, by the very people you claim to defend. Are you prepared to answer to them when things fall apart? Traoré nodded, calm and unwavering. I'll answer to them because I'll be there with them. Unlike those who rule from a distance, I live in the house I'm building. If it cracks, I feel it. If it breaks, I fix it. That last line drew applause that didn't fade quickly. It was no longer about numbers or forecasts, it was about trust. And in that moment, it was clear who had more of it. The cameras captured Bessent's face as he realized something crucial. He had underestimated not just Traoré's resolve, but the readiness of others to follow his example. The moderator gave a final glance at the clock, sensing the debate was reaching its natural climax. Gentlemen, he said, one last question, what do you hope the world remembers from this exchange? Bessent answered first, his voice measured but edged with urgency. I hope they remember that stability matters. That bold words mean little if they lead to chaos. My warning to President Traoré is the same as it is to all leaders: without cooperation, you risk losing everything you've built. Traoré let the silence settle before responding. He looked across the room, not just at Bessent, but at every face watching. And I hope they remember this: freedom is worth more than comfort. Dignity is worth more than stability bought by submission. We may stumble, but we will stand. And when we do, it will be on our own feet. The applause was immediate, swelling until it drowned out the sound of the moderator's closing remarks. The room wasn't divided evenly, some clapped out of courtesy, others with genuine conviction, but the momentum was clear. Cameras zoomed in on Traoré as he stood, adjusting his suit jacket with quiet confidence. There was no gloating, no smug smile, just the look of a man who knew his words had struck deeper than numbers or warnings ever could. Bessent rose too, extending his hand. It was a gesture of respect, but also of recognition. This was no ordinary opponent. Traoré accepted the handshake firmly, a silent acknowledgement that while they disagreed on almost everything, both had shown up and stood their ground. As the crowd began to disperse, snippets of conversation floated through the air, delegates quoting Traoré's "kneeling together" line, journalists already drafting headlines. Outside the hall, young leaders from smaller nations waited for him, eager to shake his hand. For Bessent, it was a reminder that influence could be challenged. For Traoré, it was proof that the challenge had already begun. Tonight wasn't just a debate, it was a reminder of what leadership truly means. We heard talk of risk, of instability, of warnings dressed as wisdom. But the truth is simple: freedom always comes with risk, and dignity always comes with a price. To those who believe our future depends on the approval of others, I say it does not. To those who think stability is given, not earned, I say it is built, brick, by the hands of our own people. We are not here to beg for inclusion in someone else's order. We are here to write our own chapter in history. And if the cost of standing tall is standing alone, then so be it, because the view from our own ground will always be worth more than the comfort of someone else's shadow. The world may watch with doubt. They may predict our fall. But remember this: we will stumble, we will rise, and we will walk forward. Not behind anyone. Not waiting for permission. Always forward. Always on our own feet.